Right, here we are once again on what I hope is the last day of our snowpocalypse. I had been talking about the three domains of life. All life that we know can be classified into one of these three, and we've covered the archaea and the bacteria. Both of these are made up of cells, but the cells lack a nucleus. They lack a sac of DNA. And by and large, they're not compartmentalized. They don't really have any uh, subassemblies or structures inside them. Everything happens in pretty much one space inside the cell. And cells that are organized like that, we call prokaryotes. Archaea and bacteria are both prokaryotes. They're very different from each other in ways that we haven't got time to get into. Eukaryotes, cells contain these flexible sacs of DNA. That's called the cell nucleus. And eukaryote cells are further compartmentalized. Outside of the nucleus, they contain a lot of specialized structures that do various things, and we call those organelles. So, this happens to be a human breast cancer cell, but it counts. It's a eukaryote. And the nucleus is, I'll outline it with the pen. That's the nucleus. All of this big blotchy thing. Sorry about the random lines. I don't know why it does that, but everything I've circled there is the nucleus. There's a darker spot inside the nucleus called the nucleolus, and we'll talk later about what that does. It's not critical right now. There's the nucleolus. And then all of these little bits, like right here and right there, all of these little gray things that you're seeing are organelles, and you can see them scattered throughout the cell. Um, Much later in the course, towards the end, we'll get into more detail about what those actually are and what those do. But let's not get ahead of ourselves right now. But that's a pretty typical eukaryote. We subdivide domains into kingdoms, and as far as you're concerned, there are four kingdoms of eukaryotes. The kingdom Animalia is the animal kingdom, and that includes all of the animals. Wow, how amazing. The kingdom Plantae contains true plants, everything from ferns and trees to grass and mosses. And the kingdom Fungi. Fungi includes the ones you can think of off the bat would probably be things like mushrooms, bread molds, bracket fungi, yeasts. All of those go in the kingdom fungi. And these first three are, by and large, multicellular, meaning that their bodies are made up of many cells. There's an exception in the fungi, but a typical animal, for example, would be made of anywhere from the simplest free living ones would be roughly a couple thousand cells. You, on the other hand, are made of roughly 37 trillion cells. And of course, a giraffe or a elephant or a blue whale would be made up of far more cells than that. Um, Animals, plants, and fungi also show at least some degree of cell differentiation, which just means that you have not just many cells, but they're specialized into different cell types. Your body consists of roughly 200 different types of cells, and they all do different things. The transitional epithelium lining your bladder does different things from the Purkinje cells in the cerebellum of your brain. And those do different things from the beta cells in your pancreas, and those do different things from the macrophage cells in your bloodstream, and so on. You get less of that. The simplest animals have only four different cell types. Typical plants might have maybe a couple dozen. Uh, Fungi, maybe not quite so much. But by and large, these three have cell differentiation. The fourth kingdom is not really a good kingdom. It's a grouping that we call the Protista. And the problem with the kingdom Protista is it's a wastebasket because it includes all eukaryotes that aren't animals, plants, or fungi. And this is not a good way to classify living things. Um, when I was in high school, I had a very quirky friend who loved coming up with really weird jokes. And one of his jokes was, what do a bald eagle and a brick wall have in common? And the answer is neither one can drive a stick shift. The point of that joke is, first of all, there's a lot of weird chemicals in the water where I come from. The other point of the joke is it doesn't really make sense to classify things together based on what they aren't. It's true that bald eagles and brick walls cannot drive stick shifts, but that doesn't really mean they're similar. They're different in almost every other way. And the kingdom Protista is kind of silly for the same reason because it includes all eukaryotes that don't have multicellularity and high cell differentiation. Even that is not a really good criterion, but you shouldn't classify things based on what they haven't got. And the pros actually classify eukaryotes in a very different way. The Protista are divided into multiple kingdoms and super kingdoms, and there's still debate as to the right way to do this. I've just covered this in Biology 4401 if you ever want to take that. But this is another one of those things that we just have not got time to get into. For our purposes, we're going to learn kingdoms, animals, plants, fungi, and then the kingdom Protista has an asterisk by its name. It's not really a good kingdom. It'll do for what we need to accomplish here. The Protista include quite a lot of single-celled eukaryotes. The one that you saw in the previous slide on the left, that is a pretty large, about 150 micron single-celled organism called paramecium. There is a nucleus kind of in the middle, and a lot of the other things that you see are various organelles and various other structures. This is a photosynthetic single-celled protist. Each one of those little green balls is just one cell, and in each cell there's a nucleus and organelles. It happens to be called Chlamydomonas. So that's a single-celled protist. This is something you could actually find floating in ponds and lakes around here. Not right this minute, but probably in the summer we might get a lot of it. I've seen it before. It is multicelled, but it's made of many identical cells arranged in long filaments. So it's multicellular, but we don't have cell differentiation because all of the cells look the same. So that would be a multicellular protist. Incidentally, the spiral things that you see inside each cell are a type of organelle called the chloroplast, which is where photosynthesis takes place. And in this species, it happens to be spirally shaped, which is why this is in the genus Spirogyra. Spirogyra and Chlamydomonas are also related to green algae, like the seaweeds in the genus Ulva, commonly known as sea lettuce. And these do look very plant-like. It looks like they've got leaves, but they don't have the kinds of organs that plants do, and they have relatively little cellular differentiation. They do have some, but they're not nearly as differentiated as true plants would be, and we place these in the protists as well. All of the protists that you've just seen, Chlamydomonas and Spirogyra and the sea lettuce seaweeds, feed by themselves. They're called autotrophic because they survive by building up large molecules out of small ones, like carbon dioxide and water. And this life cycle is called autotrophy, The most familiar type of autotrophy is photosynthesis. And all of the protists you've seen so far, Chlamydomonas, Spirogyra, Ulva, are photosynthetic, which means that they build up large molecules from small ones and they power the process by capturing light energy. There are other types of autotrophy that build up large molecules out of small ones but use something else as an energy source. We don't need to get into that here because the organisms that do that tend to be archaeans living in very weird environments, like 10,000 feet down at the bottom of the ocean, things like that. So the only type of autotrophy we're really going to get into here is photosynthesis. An autotrophic protist, by the way, are commonly known as algae. So I'd call all of the green protists that you've just seen algae. There are other protists that are heterotrophic. Like you, they get their energy from ingesting and breaking down large molecules. They eat, they break those molecules down, and in the process, they generate both the building blocks of their own molecules and they also generate energy. Heterotrophic protists are commonly called protozoa. We use these out in other contexts as well. You are heterotrophic. Plants are usually autotrophic, but mixotrophic protists can actually live either way. They can live either autotrophically or heterotrophically, or they can even do both at once. So that's a picture through a microscope of something you might see when you do investigation two, maybe. It is genus Euglena, and the green should tell you it's photosynthetic like a plant. All those green circles that you see inside are an organelle called a chloroplast. And then that red dot is a different organelle that's actually light sensitive. This thing can sense light and will swim towards light in order to photosynthesize, but it does swim actively. You can't clearly see them in this picture, but it's got a couple of very thin hair-like organelles called flagella sticking out of the cell that beat back and forth, enabling this to swim. And you can't see it clearly here, but it's at the upper right, and it's also got a sort of mouth called a gullet, and it can open this up and engulf food, and it can survive even if it's deprived of light. So it's a nice mixotroph. It can feed and it can photosynthesize, and it might even do both on the same day. So we could clearly say that Euglena is the Miley Cyrus of the protist kingdom because it gets the best of both worlds. If we were in lecture class, I'd actually start singing that, but it's early in the morning and my voice is not quite up to it. But you could make a song out of that, mixotroph, or I've got a better one. You could call Euglena Sir Mixotroph and say, I like to feed and I cannot lie. You other brothers can't deny, but I'm also green because I can photosynthesize. And I thought it was funny. I'm imagining all of you laughing hysterically at my attempt to do Sir Mixotroph, who was probably before you were born anyway. Damn Gen Zers. Anyway, right. Why should we care? Well, there's a ridiculously large number of protists out there living everywhere you can think of in 50 places you can't. Protists that float in oceans or lakes make up a large part of what we call phytoplankton and zooplankton. Phytoplankton, these two critters right over here, belong to a major group of protists called the dinoflagellates. They are autotrophic. They do photosynthesis. They make up what we call the phytoplankton. Plankton, by the way, doesn't mean that thing that looks like a Darvaset in SpongeBob SquarePants. Plankton in general is any organism that can't swim strongly enough to hold position in the water. Plankton is basically at the mercy of currents. And phyto is the Greek root for a plant. So plant-like plankton are the phytoplankton. And then this thing on the right over here, that happens to be a type of organism. The technical name is it's a tintinid. What you need to know is that it's a free-floating heterotroph. It feeds by itself. We say this is a member of the zooplankton. Zooplankton eat phytoplankton, and then zooplankton themselves will get eaten by things like tiny shrimp and baby fish, and those get eaten by bigger fish, and those get eaten by even bigger fish, and those get eaten by tuna, and those get eaten by you if you had a tuna salad sandwich for lunch yesterday. We'll cover this later at the very end of the course, but living things feed on each other, and as living things feed on each other, they pass energy and what we call biomass through a series of links called a trophic web. And we'll be talking more about that later. What you need to know right now is that the bottom of the trophic web, these tiny little phytoplankton and zooplankton, are the foundation for everything above. Because the phytoplankton are food for the zooplankton, and the zooplankton get eaten by little shrimp, which get eaten by bigger fish, which get eaten by really big fish, which get eaten by, valuable food fish that you might depend on for food. In a lake around here, there are phytoplankton, and they get fed on by zooplankton, and those get fed on by, I don't know, gizzard shad, and those get fed on by crappie and largemouth bass, and those get fed on by people that catch them and dip them in cornmeal batter and deep fry them. So, very important in the grand scheme of things in ecology, which we'll get to again much later in the course. There are other protists that cause deadly human diseases. These are both stained views of human blood. The round things that you're seeing are human red blood cells. These are what carry oxygen from your lungs to the rest of your body. And inside some of these red blood cells, you can see these little things that look like rings. There's one right there, and there's one right there, and there's a bunch of them, look like little diamond rings. Those rings are a protist called Plasmodium falciparum. That causes a disease called malaria. And malaria is no longer much of a risk in Arkansas, although it used to be until into the 20th century. People would get it here. But it still kills roughly 600,000 people worldwide each year. On the right, that's more human blood, and you can see these kind of pink, twisty looking things like that are merrily frolicking in their blood serum. That's a protist called Trypanosoma brucei. It causes a disease called African sleeping sickness. As late as 1998, that infected about 300,000 people every year, and killed most of them. It takes kind of a long time, but it will eventually kill you because it goes from your blood into your nervous system, and it starts doing things like disrupting your sleep patterns and ultimately putting you into a coma, hence the name sleeping sickness. Thanks to a lot of grassroots eradication efforts, currently there's fewer than 2,000 cases a year, so this is not as big a threat as it used to be, but it's still very bad for you if you get it. There are other protists that cause plant diseases. On the left, that is a microscope view of a protist called Phytophthora infestans. Phytophthora infestans can attack something like 300 different crop plants. And in 1846, it began attacking potatoes in Ireland. For about 5 years, the potato crop in Ireland was basically rotting in the ground. because it was getting attacked by a mass infection of Phytophthora infestans. The poor rural population of Ireland, by the way, depended on potatoes to survive. And when the potato crop failed because of Phytophthora, 1 million people died of famine. Over 1 million more were forced to emigrate. So if you've got Irish ancestry, this may well be the reason why they came. Over 1 million Irish people came to the U.S. Quite a lot came to Canada. Some of them went elsewhere, but a lot of the Irish American population is here because they were fleeing the famine caused by a protist, Phytophthora infestans. So there. I could teach an entire course on the protists, but we got to move. So the second eukaryotic kingdom I want you guys to know about is the kingdom fungi. And this one is a true kingdom. Remember, the Protista isn't really a real kingdom because it's defined on what it isn't. But the fungi do have a lot of features that they share that allow us to define it based on what it is. Most fungi under the microscope look like this. If you could take some of the fuzzy white mold growing on that food that you put in the fridge 2 weeks ago and were really meaning to get around to eat, no, really, if you could scrape off some of that and put it under the microscope, you'd see that that fuzz is made up of a bunch of filaments called hyphae. Each hypha, that's the singular, Hypha, is made up of many cells. And surrounding the whole thing is a cell wall made of a substance called chitin. Yes, spelled chitin, but it's chitin, Chitin. Coincidence, by the way, but chitin is also found in bug exoskeletons. Chitin is the stuff that makes cockroaches go crunch when you bite them. Sorry, I'm just envisioning all of you slightly groaning and turning a little green when I said that. Sorry about that. I'm kind of a jerk sometimes. So fungal filaments are called hyphae, and the hyphae are surrounded by a cell wall made of chitin. And a massive hyphae is called a mycelium. So if you take spoiled food out of the fridge and you see it's got this kind of maybe white or maybe green fuzzies growing on it like a tiny piece of cotton, that fuzz that you see would be a mycelium, just a big tangle of hyphae. This is a jar of used coffee grounds, and these were inoculated with the hyphae of an edible fungus called the oyster mushroom, which tastes very nice, and you can grow it on things like used coffee grounds. You can even buy kits on the internet that will tell you how to do this. And after several days, you can see those brown coffee grounds are completely covered by this white fuzzy mass. That's a mycelium. It might help you to remember this. I looked up in the shower the other day and I had mold growing on the ceiling of the shower. And being a biologist, I said, well, there's a mycelium on my ceiling. I'm envisioning you all laughing uproariously at my humor, but some people find that helps them to remember. If you have mold in your house, you too might say, I have a mycelium growing on my ceiling. And there we have some mycelial masses on spoiled food that's been left out for too long or kept in the fridge for too long. So the fuzzy white stuff on the strawberries and the green bread mold growing on that bread, those are mycelia. And they're just big masses of branching and rebranching hyphae. In many fungi, not all, hyphae in a mycelium will sometimes kind of wrap together and bundle together and make something like a big cable. And the cable will start thickening, and they'll put up a reproductive structure called a sporocarp. The most familiar type of sporocarp that you would know would be a mushroom. So that's what baby mushrooms look like in a home mushroom farm. You could buy one of these things and grow your own mushrooms if you wanted to. You put fungal mycelium in something that they'll like to grow in, like soil or dead leaves or used coffee grounds or something like that. And I think you can see the white kind of webby looking stuff is the mycelium. And then strands of mycelium have gotten thicker and thicker, formed this kind of bundle, and they're starting to send up little buttons. And in a day or two, those buttons are going to be fully grown mushrooms, which you can pick and slice up and saute with butter or whatever you like doing with mushrooms. The sporocarps in many fungi are the only part you can see. This is actually the kind of thing you can see in the spring driving around Conway, especially in the older neighborhoods. There is a mycelium growing in the soil underneath the grass, and it's probably several meters in diameter. It's a very big mycelium, but the only way we can detect it is the fact that that mycelium has just sent up a whole bunch of sporocarps. And the sporocarps are these mushrooms that you can see growing in a ring. That ring more or less marks the edge of where the mycelium is. So the mycelium is actually several feet across, and it sent up a whole bunch of sporocarps in a ring around its edge. And this is called a fairy ring because people used to believe that this marked the places where the fairies would come out at night to dance around in a circle. Um, I have never actually seen fairies doing this in a circle, probably because I have never taken the right drugs. Ozzy Osbourne claimed that fairies wear boots, but that's another story. But that fairy ring has the ring shape because it's produced at the edge of a single mycelium that might go pretty deep into the soil and is covering an area of several square feet. The largest living thing in the world happens to be a fungal mycelium. Nobody has ever seen anything like the entire mycelium itself, but it grows through the soil, covering 2,200 acres, or in metric, that's 890 hectares, more than 6 times the size of the core UCA campus. That's how big the thing is. It grows in the Malheur National Forest in Oregon. I don't have a picture of it, but this is a relative. That's an aerial photo of a forest in Montana, and you can see these light patches like that. I'll circle one for you. And there's another one up here, and then there's this one up here. Those light patches are areas where the trees are not growing very well. The trees are getting weak, and they're getting weak because the same fungus is growing into their roots and draining energy from them and weakening them. It's a parasitic fungus. And each one of those patches is a whole stand of trees that's being attacked by one giant mycelium. And each one of those patches is about 20 acres in size. By the way, if you're not clear on how big an acre is the size of a regulation American football field from one 5 yard line to the other 5 yard line. So take a football field, cut off the end zones, and cut off about 10 more yards, and that's an acre. So 20 acres is going to be what, roughly 18 football fields in size. There's a humongous fungus among us. There are fungi, however, that don't form hyphae. They don't form a multicellular stage, or at least they don't form hyphae for part of their lifespan. Some fungi can switch back and forth. And fungi that don't form hyphae still have a chitin cell wall, and they've still got nuclei and organelles, and we call these fungi yeasts. And this is what yeast look like under the microscope. They are single-celled. The common bread yeast, because yes, these are the yeast that we add to things like bread, bread dough. When they're alive, they are single cells. They're kind of oval or shape and or football in shape, and they multiply by budding off little buds that get bigger and bigger. There are some yeast, incidentally, that switch hit. This is a yeast called Candida albicans. This slide has been stained, and the yeast are showing up as dark purple. You can see there are some filaments, but there's also some little purple football-shaped cells growing in clusters. So in the case of Candida albicans, you can see both hyphae and you can see the single-celled stages of the same species, because this one will do both. This, incidentally, is a slide of discharge from a human vagina. Candida albicans causes vaginal yeast infections. It also can cause infections of the lining of the mouth, particularly in very young babies. If anybody's ever heard of something called thrush, that is a Candida albicans infection of the inside of the mouth of usually of a baby, usually a very young baby. Fairly easily treatable, but that's a fungal infection that humans can get. Recently, there's a new one called Candida aurea that's been making the news because it's extremely difficult to treat and it's been spreading through hospitals. Many fungi have sex, although not all of them do. In the ones that do, what happens is two hyphae that have to be of different mating types will come together. You can see this happening here. These two objects on the slide are two hyphae of opposite mating types that have touched each other and started swelling. And what they will do is make a new hypha that contains DNA from both of the parental hyphae. Incidentally, one common fungus was recently found to have over 23,000 different mating types. Not every living thing is only male or female. You thought it was hard to date. Imagine how hard it is for these fungi to find a date when they've got to scroll through a list of 23,000 different mating types just to find somebody that's compatible. There are other fungi that only have one mating type. So sex in the fungi can have complications not known to us humans. Anyway, two hyphae of different mating types will join together. A new hypha will grow from the point where they join, and it will contain genetic material from both parents. So those are those two hyphae joining together. That new hypha produced by sexual reproduction will divide at one end and give rise to a lot of little single-celled spores. The spores are microscopic. They fall off. They'll drift away on the wind. And if they find conditions to be right, they will sprout into new hyphae. So up here on the left, on the light microscope, on the right, that's a picture taken through a scanning electron microscope. And in both of them, you can see there's a hypha that ends in a big cluster of these little oval spores. And the spores will break off and they'll drift away. And maybe they will find some new food in the fridge that you forgot about and start growing into new hyphae, and they'll form a new mycelium, and round goes the circle of life. In many species, that sexual hypha is what branches and then webs together and forms a big sporocarp. And the sporocarp may produce many millions of spores. Mushrooms are by far the most familiar sporocarps. If you look carefully on the underside of a mushroom, usually depends on the mushroom, but usually you'll see little folds called gills, and specialized hyphae on the gills produce spores. And one mushroom might produce many millions of spores that will fall off the base of the mushroom cap and go drifting away on the wind and ultimately grow into new myceliums. You'll see a lot of these if you hit the nature reserve at the right time of year. There are mushrooms in the nature reserve that I've eaten that are quite delicious. There are also mushrooms in the nature reserve that will kill you if you eat them in a very nasty way over the course of about a week, and the only cure is if you can get a liver transplant. And those grow in the nature reserve as well. Oh, there's also nature mushrooms in the nature reserve that'll make you see things. I'm not going to tell you where they grow, but there are mushrooms that if you eat them in the nature reserve, they'll make you see God. And there's mushrooms that if you eat them, you will see God permanently. Well, hopefully permanently. Anyway, so mushrooms are sporocarps. Another type that you might see, that was a tree in Laurel Park that I photographed years ago. Growing out of that tree, you have a whole bunch of semicircular things that look like little shelves, and those are called shelf fungi or bracket fungi. You'll see a lot of these on rotting wood. There's a few of these that are edible. There's a species called chicken of the woods that's actually quite tasty. And that's another type of sporocarp. You might have seen or heard of jelly fungi, crust fungi, coral fungi, puffballs. Once those are mature, if you touch a puffball, it'll shoot out a jet of what looks like smoke, and that's actually spores. Truffles and morels and earth stars. There's lots and lots of different fungal sporocarps that you can find. Some of which are deadly, some of which just are nasty, and some of which are absolutely delicious. Fungi that we haven't caught we haven't caught them reproducing sexually, are lumped together in an informal group called the fungi imperfecti. And the reason I mentioned the fungi imperfecti is that some of them cause human illness. Athlete's foot is caused by a mycelium of an imperfect fungus growing through the outer layers of your skin. So is ringworm. Ringworm is not really a worm at all. It makes these raised red areas that look like you've got a worm coiled on your skin, but that's actually caused by a fungus. So is jock itch. So is this thing called barber's itch that you can get in your beard region. So is this thing that can cause your skin to lose its pigment called tinea versicolor. Those are all caused by imperfect fungi growing in your skin. Green fuzzy bread mold is also an imperfect fungus. It has never been documented reproducing sexually. Um, Athlete's foot and those other skin diseases caused by fungi can be really annoying, but they're rarely medically serious. I've never heard of anybody dying of athlete's foot. The only person who ever died of jock itch was Captain Hook. But fungi that get deeper into the body can be very dangerous indeed, especially in patients whose immune system has been damaged. That would include people with full blown HIV infection, people that are showing signs of what's called AIDS, people that are taking immunosuppressive drugs to suppress an autoimmune disease like lupus, or people who are immunocompromised because they're taking immunosuppressive drugs to suppress the rejection of an organ transplant. So all of those people have lowered resistance to infection, and sometimes they can get very severe fungus infections that a completely healthy person might not worry about. What you're looking at here is a stained slide of a yeast. It's called Pneumocystis jirovecii. All of those dark gray stained ovals are yeast cells. Remember, yeast are single-celled fungi. And Pneumocystis jirovecii causes very severe pneumonia in AIDS patients, often lethal. When you have AIDS, you don't technically die of the AIDS itself. You die of infections that your body is no longer able to fight off, like these yeast infections deep in your lungs. So there are other fungi that are extremely useful to humans. A yeast called Saccharomyces, if you add it to bread dough with a little sugar, the Saccharomyces yeast will break down the sugar, and as waste products, it will produce ethyl alcohol and carbon dioxide gas. If you add that yeast to bread dough, the dough will rise, and that reflects the fact that you've got these yeast in there that are producing so much carbon dioxide gas, they're putting bubbles into the bread dough, and that's how you get, well, bread, or at least light and fluffy bread. That bread has been had yeast added to it. The dough's been allowed to rise as the yeast produce those bubbles, and then baking kills the yeast and also gets rid of the alcohol, and you're left with a fluffy loaf of bread. If you add yeast, by the way, to another solution containing sugar, like grape juice or malt extract of grain or honey diluted a bit with water, the yeast will break down the sugar in your grape juice or your honey or your other fruit juice or your malt extract or whatever it is, and produce lots of carbon dioxide gas and lots of alcohol. And this is how you get fermented alcoholic drinks: wine, beer, mead if you did it with honey, cider if you did it with apple juice, and so on. Pruno if you did it with fruit scraps stolen out of the prison commissary and stuffed into a plastic bag that you keep in the toilet tank so the guard doesn't know it's there. Not that I would know. But yeah, yeast are used to generate alcohol and carbon dioxide. In bread, we keep the carbon dioxide. In beer and wine, we keep the alcohol, and we may keep the carbon dioxide in the case of champagne or naturally conditioned beer. Edible mushrooms, of course, you can forage those from the wild, but they're also grown commercially. I know people who make money growing things like oyster mushrooms and lion's mane mushrooms and shiitake mushrooms. Truffles are hard to find and very expensive. People make money off of those. There are other foods than beer that are fermented using fungi. Soy sauce is an example. Miso is a Japanese food product. You might have had miso soup if you've ever eaten Japanese food around here. Miso is produced by adding fungus to, I think it's soybeans. Fungi are deliberately added to certain cheeses to produce flavor. So blue cheese has its flavor and its color and those blue streaks in it because a specific fungus has been deliberately added to it. And as the fungus breaks down the cheese, it produces these byproducts that give the cheese its flavor. Brie is also a cheese that has deliberately had fungi added to it. And there's even commercially grown fungi that produce, you can grow these things in a big vat and harvest these fungi and produce these protein rich meat substitutes. I took this picture in one of the Kroger in grocery stores in Conway a few years ago. This is a product called Quorn, and you can get it around here, and it's a meat substitute made out of fungi. I have not actually tasted it. I don't know whether it's that good, but somebody is making money off of it, and that's a commercial use for fungi. Last but not least, fungi that grow in the soil may have to compete with bacteria for access to food because fungi are decomposers, and fungi produce, as part of the competition, fungi produce a number of bacteria killing compounds that we call antibiotics. Probably the most famous was penicillin. Penicillin, the quote, new wonder drug from mold, is actually produced by a species of fungus called Penicillium notatum, grown in big vats and extracted and purified. There's a lot of derivatives of penicillin like ampicillin and cloxacillin and cephalosporin and so on. And that all started in 1928 when a Scottish microbiologist named Alexander Fleming was growing bacteria in a dish containing a nutrient gel. And he was kind of sloppy with his technique, and a spore of Penicillium notatum drifted onto the dish and grew into a mycelium. You can see the actual dish right there with that fuzzy stuff in the middle. That's the mycelium. And Fleming noticed that the fungus produced some substance that stopped bacteria from growing in the dish. Well, the discovery kind of sat on the shelf for a while, but starting in World War II, an Australian guy working in Britain named Howard Florey started growing penicillium mold and extracting penicillin and treating people with infections. Florey turned to American researchers who had expertise in growing fungi, and they collaborated and developed a process to produce large quantities of pure penicillin. And it saved countless thousands of lives in World War II. You may not know this, but up until fairly recently, in any war, more soldiers died of disease than died of bullets. That's turned around since World War II, and penicillin was a major reason why. And after the war, penicillin came onto the civilian market and started curing a lot of infections that were much more difficult to cure before then. And we owe it all to a fungus and a microbiologist who noticed something interesting in one of the dishes he was about to throw away. And I do believe that's all I've got for you, and it's 10:50. So I am going to stop the recording, and once I've got it stopped, we can all cuss. And we're stopping now.